Criminal acts can vary in many ways. The one I find to be the worst, that is severe and can have long-lasting influence on society, is homicide. Surviving victims of homicide can be affected badly due to the untimely death of a loved one. The victims can benefit from statistical knowledge about homicides. It not only affects the person who lost their lives, but their family and friends can be affected horribly as well. It can also affect neighbors and possibly even the community where the victim lived. Have you ever lost someone close to you? How did it make you feel? Now imagine if they were taken unexpectedly by another person and you have no idea how, why, or who did it. I'm going to be talking about the survivors of homicide attempts, the extent of homicide rates in the United States, and the typical homicide victims. Survivors of homicide victims are those who are greatly affected by someone who was murdered. Survivors of homicide might find themselves with unexpected financial circumstances, such as funeral, medical expenses, and psychiatric care for family members. These are serious consequences that contribute to the continuing distress that the survivors of homicide suffer. A large majority of homicide survivor victims suffer emotional problems, such as shock, grief, and a crushing feeling of helplessness at the loss of someone who was close to them. These survivors would have had some type of connection with the person murdered and were therefore victimized, not only by losing someone close to them, but also by the horrible conditions of their untimely, unfortunate death. The survivors must learn to deal with identifying the body, going to a morgue, and seeing body bags. They may also have to deal with seeing crime scene pictures, autopsies, and other stressors that are essential in homicide trials. Survivors of homicide might not be able to work normally, their motivation may be different, and they might lose sight of what was once important at work before. Some survivors may have emotional outbursts while working, causing a scene, among other problems for them. Though some might throw themselves into their work to avoid feeling their grief. Knowing statistics on crime rate can assist in figuring out how to help the victim in need. Throughout history, there have been studies of gradual increases and decreases in the crime rate. The rate has constantly been adjusted to the population at the time of calculation. Today we go by 100,000 people. These studies are done in 3 different ways. The first way is the Uniform Crime Report. The UCR calculates the crime rate for 100,000 residents. The second is the National Crime Victimization Survey. The NCVS measures criminal victimization experiences. The data taken is then used to estimate the total amount of crime. The third is self-report surveys. Self-report surveys are surveys or interviews that ask those who commit crimes to reveal their criminal behaviors. These statistic rates help us gain an understanding of typical homicide victims. Sadly, homicide is the second leading cause of death in infants. Death by firearm is more common from age 10 to 65. There are between 14 and 15,000 registered murder victims each year. 78% of the victims were males. Around 50% of murder victims are black, 47% are white, and the remaining 3% of victims are other races. The occurrences of there being only a single victim and one single offender is about 48%. The UCR shows that about 94% of the victims are killed by someone age 18 or older. Roughly 92% of black victims are murdered by black offenders, and 83% of white victims are murdered by white offenders. The UCR shows that about 90% of female victims were killed by male offenders, but most commonly murders where the criminal's gender was identified, about 90% were males. When it comes to murderers whose race is identified, roughly 54% were black, 44% were white, and 2% were other races. Of the homicides for which the type of weapon was specified, about 73% of murders recorded involved the use of guns, handguns being about 88% of them. When it comes to female victims, 33% were murdered by their husbands or boyfriends. About 42% of victims were murdered during arguments. About 23 were killed while committing a crime. Circumstances were unknown for about 37% of reported homicides. Having statistics on crime and who is most likely to kill or be killed can prevent killings in the future. The majority of homicide survivor victims suffer emotional problems. Throughout history, there have been studies on gradual increases and decreases in the criminal crime rate. Knowing statistics on who is more likely to be a victim and why can help stop a murder. For example, knowing that a female is most likely to be killed by a partner due to a domestic dispute would tell an officer who receives a distress call for this reasoning to hurry to that location to prevent a murder.